If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn into the Psalm 39. Turn it to Psalm 39. This is where we'll spend our time. You know, one of the amazing things, I don't know if you find it amazing, I do, about the Bible is the fact that the Bible speaks to us on many different levels of communication. For instance, it speaks to us in what would be called propositions, where Paul gives us a command of some kind. He says, when he answers the Philippian jailer, as we talked about in Sunday school, what must I do to be saved? Believe in the Lord Jesus, that he died for your sins and rose again on the third day, and you and your whole household will be saved. That's a proposition. He's telling the jailer something propositionally. There's another way the Bible speaks to us. It speaks to us in commands. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That's a command. That's a decree. That's a place where the Bible speaks to us. It speaks to us in realms like of history, giving us facts about things that happen. But one place it speaks to us that it's so complete in the way it speaks to us, and one of those portions of how it speaks to us is on the level of what we would call our heart. That is, our emotional being, who we are as people. It speaks to us on a level that touches our emotions in ways that very little else does. So the Psalms are one of those places where you find that kind of speaking, that sort of speech, the kind of thing that's going to come underneath us. Maybe it's going to lift us up. Maybe it's going to make us happy. Maybe it's going to make us reflective. Maybe it's going to break us so that God can do some work in us. Let's take a look at this text. Psalm 39. I'll begin reading in verse 1. I decided, oh, by the way, from the music director Jeduthun, a psalm of David. I decided I'll watch what I say and make sure that I don't sin with my tongue. I'll put a muzzle over my mouth while in the presence of an evil person. I was stone silent and I held back the urge to speak. My frustration grew. My anxiety intensified. I thought about it and I became impatient. Finally, I spoke these words. O Lord, help me understand my mortality and the brevity of life. Let me realize how quickly my life will pass. Look, you made my days short-lived. My span is nothing from your perspective. Surely all the people, even those who seem very secure, are nothing but a vapor. Surely people go through life like mere ghosts. Surely they accumulate worthless wealth, and without knowing who will eventually haul that wealth away. But now, O Lord, upon what am I relying? You are my only hope. Deliver me from the sins of my rebellion. Do not make me the object of fools' insults. I am silent. I cannot open my mouth because of what you've done. Stop wounding me. You've almost beaten me to death. You severely discipline people for their sins. Like a moth, you slowly devour their strength. Surely all people everywhere are a mere vapor. Selah. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not ignore my sobbing and my tears, for I'm dependent on you. Like one residing outside his native land, I am at your mercy just as all my ancestors were at your mercy. Turn your angry gaze away from me so that I can be happy before I pass away. Now, this is certainly an emotional, I'm going to say it for what it is. It's a prayer. David is praying here. Even though it's a psalm, he is praying. And one thing about when we use the word, I don't even like this word, but it's one we use. It's the word religion. We talk about religion. You know, that comes from Latin. And what it means, nobody knows. If you go to any dictionary, you will find every dictionary different on what that word means. Nobody knows what the word religion means. They just don't. We don't have a good definition. But from the Latin from which it comes, it literally carries with it the picture of being bound, that a person is bound. That's what religion means in what's known as, in language, its etymology. That is the source of it, the word itself. Religion, in that understanding, causes us to bury our feelings. right? If a person's going to be religious, what pictures does that bring up in our heads? Somebody who's very pious, very quiet, very reflective. That's the picture we get. However, the Psalms are telling us something entirely different here about our emotions. You know, the world right now, if a person is outside of Christianity, they don't have a relationship with God. Religion will cause us to bury our feelings, but the person who doesn't know God, their feelings are God. Their feelings are God for them. Because their feelings dictate everything about the way in which they approach the world. So if I feel something about something, that's how it is. Very different. Now, for some people, praying our feelings is a very easy thing for some people to do. Some people have no problem coming before the Lord and bringing their feelings to Him in the most direct way possible. They don't filter it, they don't try to hide anything. They just come before God and they tell Him what they think, how it feels. And this is one of the most frustrating things to me, and I say this to give you a little window into my world. When we have the prayer time here at church and we've got this huge list of things we're praying for on Wednesday night or on Sunday mornings, I realize that seems very dry from your perspective, and I fully empathize with it. If I were sitting where you are and someone else were up here praying, after about a minute or two, it would start to feel dry to me. There's just no avoiding that. It's very hard to maintain that sense of fervency when someone else is praying about things. And I understand that. I know God does as well. But think of it like this. When we're doing that, we are literally co-working with God to change the world. That's what we're doing. I know it doesn't seem like that, but that's exactly what we're doing. When Colin brings to our minds the fact that there's some family members for somebody who's lost in the ocean, we are asking God to change the world for them when we pray. Now you'll notice something else about Psalms, and this is pretty universal. Just like our music, what are the most poignant songs we have? They are generally the sad ones. Almost all songs that we feel very connected to emotionally when we hear them are kind of sad. There's an element there of sadness. The Psalms are the same. They're the same. Even though they start out that way, they generally will end in a different way. And there's a clue about what the Psalms are there for us. What the psalmist does in most cases is take us on a kind of emotional journey where we're going to be made perhaps saddened in some way by what we see, like the psalmist is perhaps saddened. And then they're going to take us on an emotional journey where we're going to invest our sadness or our emotions in some way, and when we come out on the other side of it, we're going to be changed by it. That's a really important feature of the Psalms. There's an expectation in the Psalms for sadness and for tears and for emotion. Psalm 126, I don't know if you've ever read that. It's very short, and if you want to read it, that's a good thing to do. He says this, he says, those who shed tears will plant. They will then shout for joy when they reap the harvest. In other words, there's something being done with tears here that tells us that on the other side of those tears is something other than the tears. The text in Psalm 126 refers to something very, very big. You know, nobody knows when that psalm was written, nor do they know what it's talking about. The reason is, you could look at it and say, well, it was written during the time of Hezekiah and the Assyrian siege. Maybe so. Or it was written during the time of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian disaster. Or maybe it was written in some of the judgments and things that happened in between. We don't know. But one thing's for sure, whatever was happening there was causing a tremendous amount of emotion in the writer of the psalm. He uses all kinds of imagery. He talks about the Negev and the desert as a metaphor for being dry and distant and apart from God. And then he talks about the harvest after the tears have been planted, and then the reaping of the harvest afterward. You know, if you and I, as we walk through this world, once we become born again, it is inevitable that we will find ourselves in places in life where tears and sadness become increased because we are born again. Now, why would that be? And by the way, from the perspective of where I'm standing, think how hard that is to sell to somebody who comes to church for the first time, and you say to them, you know, when you get born again, you're going to find yourself more emotionally connected, and you're going to find yourself more connected to sadnesses as you go through your life. Some would look at that and say, well, that doesn't sound very good. I don't even like the sound of that at all. Why do I want to sign up for that? Well, there's a reason for it. And the reason is that once we become born again, we become open to God in a way that we never have been before. The Spirit of God lives in us. And once the Spirit of God comes into us, He is going to do what He intends to do in us no matter what. It's kind of like C.S. Lewis says this. He says, when I was a child, I would lie in bed, and perhaps I had a toothache. And he says, I wanted so desperately to go to my mother just for the comfort that she would give me because I had the toothache. But I didn't do that because I knew once I went for the comfort, I was in for the full treatment. I'm going to the dentist tomorrow. That is exactly like God. We come to Him for the comfort, rightly so. But when we do, we also find ourselves in for the full treatment. He's going to do what He intends to do in us to make us who He sees us to be. And this heart change, because we've been born again, makes us more vulnerable to the effects of what we see in the world. Look, a person who isn't a believer, they're not going to feel any deep connection to say what's going on in Ukraine for innocent people, unless that just happens to be how they're wired. But if you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus and the Spirit of God lives in you and you hear about what's going on in Ukraine, there is no way that a believer can step away from that with no feelings about it whatsoever. We become impacted by things. The idea of the soft heart, Ezekiel chapter 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, that something happens to us when God comes to live in us that changes our hearts in such a way that we're no longer able to just distance ourselves from the pain and suffering in the world. We become part of it in some ways. It becomes part of us. And I would say this, I mean, think about it. If we say, well, I want to grow in grace, which is a kind of a flowery thing to say anyhow. I mean, I don't know exactly what that means. But we say it a lot, right, in church. It's kind of church speak. What are we saying? Well, I think we're saying I want to be more like Jesus. What does that mean? Jesus is called the man of sorrows. That's who He's called. If we don't expect that we're going to find ourselves emotionally stricken in ways that we might not have been otherwise, I wonder if our hearts are as soft as they ought to be. They can be very useful, tears can, when they're invested properly. That psalm I mentioned earlier, Psalm 126, and the one we've just read, in every instance you see this kind of investment of sadness, this investment of tears, and then the reaping of something else, the joy. Now, I use that word, and please forgive me, it's just a word that the Bible uses. I don't really understand it fully, do you? Joy. I can tell you, I'll let you into a little window into my world. If you want one, you might not. You might say, well, we really don't want to look into your world. I can understand that, but I'm going to do it anyhow. When I'm preparing a sermon, there are moments in the sermon, for me, I can't speak for anybody but myself, wherein all of a sudden, for whatever reason, something about the sermon will bring me to a place where I'm thinking about something in life that caused me a deep emotion of some kind. Sometimes it's sadness. Sometimes it's just I don't even know what word to put to it. And I pray in that moment when I'm preparing the sermon, I say, Lord, please, whatever you do, don't let this that I'm feeling now be wasted on Sunday. Don't let it be wasted. It means something. Maybe just for me, but don't let it be wasted. And the paradox of this is that when we plant that kind of emotion, it produces a harvest of something different than the emotion planted. When we plant sadness with God, it produces a harvest of something very different than the sadness. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He says, "For our light affliction is but for a moment, producing for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." You know, the word for glory actually means a weight. A weight. W-E-I-G-H-T. That's why Lewis titles one of his books, "The Weight of Glory." There's a problem for us, and this is a problem for us and for the psalmist. You can't describe some of this stuff. I don't know about you, and I hope I don't do this. I try not to, very desperately. I try not to get caught up in what I call church speak, where you get into a church setting and a pastor comes, or whoever's going to do the speaking that day, and they use all kinds of descriptive language about heaven or about the joys of the Lord. I mean, all that. They're taking it from the Bible. But I just got to be honest here and say, I don't have a clue what any of that means. That's the truth. Unless I feel it. I can't string words together. The psalmist is struggling the same way, using all this language about harvesting and reaping and tears and joy and all these biblical words, trying so desperately to communicate something to the reader, or at that time, the hearers of the songs they were writing, trying to communicate something that can't be communicated in words. There are some things that you and I are going to have in us as emotional content that can only be caught. It can't be taught. Nobody can teach me or you what it is to have those moments of being so changed by the emotion that God invests in us in a moment. I mean, you hear people talk like this, and I don't think it's bad. I'm just saying this is how it is. They walk out on a beautiful sunrise, and they see the sunrise, and they see the beauty, and they think about it. They think about, look at what God has done, or whatever they think. There is no way they can describe that feeling to you or to me and make it understandable. But if you're standing there next to them, you understand. I understand. So this is where God, these emotional things that we feel are not to be wasted, because they will produce in us, as Paul says, a greater weight of glory, whatever that really means. It's good. How about that? Somebody was talking to me once about heaven, and we were going back and forth about what it'll be like and all that, and I said, you know, when you boil it all down, I just know it'll be nice. It'll be nice. I can be pretty confident of that. So, what are some possible ways in which God can use these emotional things in us? For one thing, I would say is He understands. He understands what's in us. He understands why we feel the way we do. The psalmist says here in this psalm, in Psalm 39, he says, "Turn your face away from me, Lord." Why does he say that? He knows who he is, right? He knows that he's a sinner. He says, my sin is great. Mine is too. All of ours is, relative to who God is. And so there's a sense in which this psalmist, David, is bringing up some kind of emotional content that, as best as he can, he's trying to communicate it to you and to me so that it makes sense to us, so that when we come to God with our own emotions, we see that there's something to be gained here by doing that. Think about it like a small child. You've all been in the presence of us. I'm talking about a toddler. They can communicate a little bit. And you see the small child come to you. There are tears streaming down their face. They're just heartbroken. They don't have the tools to communicate why they feel the way they do. But you as the parent or the adult kind of understands. That's like it is with God. God is like that. There are just going to come times where I do not have the words to get across to you what it is these things might make me feel. Neither does the psalmist. We're just doing the best we can. Some of these things have to be caught. They can't be taught. Some of these things just have to be felt. And so I remember this family I worked with in Pennsylvania, I've probably told you about before. 3 years I met with the husband. The wife, some other women in the church were meeting with her for 3 years. They had lost a child, a young child. And they lost this child in the most tragic way. I mean, the woman's inside vacuuming. She realizes she doesn't see her son. She looks out the kitchen window and sees her son floating in the pool. And he's gone. How could they ever communicate what that feels like to anybody and make it make sense? They can't. You have to catch that. You can't teach it. But God understands it. He understands it. Think about it from this standpoint. We call Jesus the man of sorrows, right? He was on the cross. He was in the garden. He was praying. He was asking God to, I'm going to say he was asking God not to let anything stop him from what he had to do. A lot of people looked at that passage in the garden and they say, well, Jesus was asking for God to bring him an alternative. I don't think that's true at all. I think Jesus knew exactly why he was here, and he was just praying that nothing would interfere with him doing what he came to do. But think about Jesus, all right? They take him, they put him on the cross, and then all of a sudden, in a moment in time, Jesus looks up at the Father and he sees the door slammed and all the locks set behind the door. And he sees God turn away from him and leave him there alone. Nobody on this earth except Jesus knows what that is like. Nobody. We think ourselves in certain moments to be abandoned by God. Not true. There's only been one who's been abandoned by God. And he hung on the cross for us. Think about it from Jesus' perspective. He's up there, and there are people out in the crowd, right, that are seeing this whole thing take place. Some of them knew him when he was a toddler. They knew him since he was born, and they've maybe heard him preach. They've heard him go through all the processes up to the point that he's put on the cross, and they walk away and they don't believe. They don't believe. Think how that would feel. God paid a terrible price for you and for me so that we would never have to know that abandonment, nor would anybody on the planet ever have to know that abandonment. So I wonder, why do we fight this so? Why do we equate who we are as believers with religion and a sense of I've got to be a pious person, as opposed to somebody who just lets it all out before God? I think it's culture to some degree on two levels. One is that sense of I've got to be a pious person. The other is, if you're really going to take time to spend time with God, our culture tells us that's really not a productive use of your time. That's what the culture says, right? I mean, think of it. If you're a business person and you've got an office full of people and you assign somebody something to do and they take longer than you think they ought, and you ask them why they did it, and you say, well, they say to you, well, I've had some things in my life I really wanted to pray about. What? What are you talking about? You've got something you've got to do. But stop and think about it. You and I at my house, I've got an average home. At our house, I have a refrigerator, so I don't have to go out and pick the vegetables every day or go and shoot the whatever I'm going to eat every day. I leave it in the refrigerator, so that saves me time. I've got a stove and electricity coming into the house. That saves me a bunch of time. I got a microwave. I mean, if something's cold and I want it hot, I throw it in there for 2 minutes, it's ready to go. I've got a car. I didn't come over to Manor today in a horse and buggy. That saves me a ton of time. You would think that with all these time-saving devices that modern life gives us, we would have all kinds of free time to spend with God and to work these things out like this. But you know what the most common excuse is for people who say, when we talk about prayer or something like that in church? I'm so busy. With a microwave? I mean, should we really be that busy if we've got a microwave? The Psalms always end up this way. They always end up in praise. Why is that? Well, seems to me like the psalmist has invested his sadness and his tears and his anxiety and all the things that are giving him so much trouble that he would write a sad song. And it's producing in him what? The reflection that wants to praise God and thank God and think about how good God is. How does that happen? It's because the investment's being made. That takes a little time. And it also takes something else that's very hard for a lot of people. And that is not caring about how we show up in God's presence. I don't care what's on anybody's mind. I don't care what we think about what should be pious behavior. Hands folded. I don't care about any of that. You know why I don't care about it? Because I know God doesn't care. What He wants is you and me to show up with everything that we are, just as we are. Think about this for just a minute. We use the word worship a lot. From the perspective of people who don't believe, you know who worship's for? Think for a minute now. Who is worship for? From the perspective of somebody who doesn't believe in God, who's the worship for? For God. But that's just completely wrong. Worship is not for... Does God need anything? He needs nothing. So, the worship must be for something else. It's for you and me. Think about the two humans in the garden. What worship service did they have? Before the fall, what did they do? They just went out and they were. They just would be before God. And that was reflecting God's character back to Him. And that was enough. We worship because we are trying, and God is using worship to get us back to a place. What's the best place for human flourishment? If God exists, the best place for human flourishment is that we would be as close as possible to Him. That's what worship is for. It's for us. Now, this is going to take a lifetime. It's going to take a lifetime. But it's worth the investment. I mean, do you and I have needs that we can't express? Do we have emotional? Do we have feelings that we can't bring out? Feelings we can't even articulate, can't even make the words fit together. Yeah, I do. Maybe I'm the only one. But God knows every one of those and understands every one of those fully. So I don't know about anybody else, but I'm going to do what the psalmist does. I'm going to bring those feelings to God, and I'm fully confident He's going to meet me there. He'll meet you there as well. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I said anything about what you've got a question you want to